All right, welcome everyone to our YouTube live session. First thing, please go to the RSVP link and fill out the form. If you are watching a recording, you don't need to worry about that. Just sit back and enjoy the show. And we have a chat. Make sure you go and engage in the chat. We have chat moderators which will answer your questions, and we want this to be as interactive as possible. So feel free to use the chat as we go. All right. So I am Pierre Saint-Just. I am a software engineer at Google. I've been at Google for about a year and a half. I work on the Google Assistant for Android. So if you have a Pixel phone and you say, okay, Google, what time is it? I help make that happen. And I am here because I do a lot of recruiting events. I've been to different schools. I do a lot of interviews. And I'm really excited about sharing some of my wisdom about the process.
Yeah, hi, and my name is Jonathan Drake. I'm also a software engineer, and I work on the search ranking team. I'm also involved with university recruiting, and I've been at Google for a little over 2.5 years, and for a lot of that, I've been doing about one interview a week, interviewing new candidates, and I think this will be my week of my 50th interview.
That's a lot. So hey everyone, my name is Lauren Long, and I'm also a software engineer. I work on Firebase as the developer product. I've been in the San Francisco office for 8 months now, so I've recently gone through the recruiting process, and I'm looking forward to talking to you more about that today.
All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about your interview experience here as a full-time candidate. So let me just sort of explain the way we have this process set up. The first step is to complete a coding sample and survey. Your job is to send us a sample of you writing good, nice code. This is an online thing that you'll complete. I think you have about an hour to do it. You're not allowed to use outside resources. The point is just to sort of show us that you can write good code. And then assuming that goes well, then you have a couple of phone interviews, usually 2, maybe 3, and these are done over a Google Doc. And you'll write code in this Google Doc, fighting a little formatting. The point is to show us that you know what you mean well enough to even do it in a Google Doc. And this will be followed up by coming to a Google office to do on-site interviews. And so over the course of a day, starting in the morning, having lunch, going to the afternoon, you'll have about 3 to 4 interviews. These are each about 45 minutes in length, and you have a little bit of time between to ask questions to your interviewers. It's as much a time for you to get to know us as it is a time for us to get to know you. And that process, I'd say try to have fun. Each interview is independent, not only from each other, but like from your phone interviews and your coding assessment. It's all separate. The idea is to get a bunch of different opinions to allow no one bad or especially good experience either to sort of mess up anything overall. We want to have a nice, well-rounded understanding of you as a candidate. And that's kind of how the on-site process goes. After that, your interview packet, all this information in aggregate goes to a separate group of people who review it. And this committee decides whether or not to hire you at which level. And hopefully then you get your offer after that. All right, I think that's all for that.
So one thing that we want to address is how you communicate during this interview. And you might be doing some practice questions, you might be learning a lot of technical things, but you'd also want to focus on ensuring that you communicate and present during yourself effectively during this process. So Pierre's going to cover that a bit more.
So, right, so how do you do this? The way you do this is we want to see how the candidate analyzes the problem. And what this means is one very easy trick is when you get the question, you give the naive solution first, right? So you said, okay, this is the problem. One very basic way to do it is to solve it this way. So that way you kind of, right out of the gate, you give the interviewer an understanding that you see how to approach the problem and you know how to solve it. It is also very important to talk about edge cases. When you talk about edge cases, you're demonstrating that you have some maturity with writing code. So, are you going to get null inputs, right? Empty strings, or whatever the different corner cases are. And that's something you want to handle first. When you start writing your code, right at the very beginning, you handle your edge cases, right? That's very important. And once again, as you go through the process of first having the naive approach, then you can start more methodically talking about the different ways you think about the problem to solve the issue, right? So we spend a lot of time looking at making sure you understand the fundamental programming concepts. Do you know the right data structures to use? Do you understand algorithmic complexity, right? And do you have proficiency in that particular language that you're using? The main goal of the interview is to get you to have working code at the end. So what the interviewer tries to do is help you along the way, right? Make sure you have proper comprehension and gives you, the right guidance to make sure you have working solution. Another piece that's extremely important is the code easy to read? A lot of the solutions that we're looking for, in many cases, you can write in about 34 lines of code. And is it something that the interviewer can just look at and understand? If the code is getting too complex and it's hard to either read or maintain, you have a lot of unnecessary variables and things like that going on, just cluttering the solution, then that's a sign that maybe you don't have a clear idea of what the solution could be. And finally, whenever, as you're writing code, I would say every 10 minutes or so, make sure you reiterate what you're trying to do. Make sure you say, okay, this is the overall idea I'm trying to make, and this is the step that I am, and to make sure that the interviewer is always following and understand how you're presenting. So that is very important.
And on the Google Students YouTube channel here, there's resources out there to help you. For example, there's a video called Applying to Google, How to Ace the Technical Interview. And that's another resource for you to see how to sort of go about this process and not be intimidated by it and learn lots of good skills for doing well.
Great. I want to talk a little bit about the phone interviews in particular. So you might be especially nervous about these because you're on the phone, you're not able to see your interviewer. But here are some tips to ensure that you make the most of this interview as well. First is we do use Google Doc for you to show your code to your interviewer. So some things you can do before you even hop on the phone is changing your font to something readable. Courier New is one that we would recommend. Reduce the size so that you can fit more code into one screen. You also want to be turning off spell check and autocorrect so that while you're coding, you're not getting your variable names corrected to a different spelling. So that's very important. And some things I always like to do before phone interviews, I like to have a cup of tea and a cup of water nearby. And that ensures that my voice stays smooth and that because I notice when I'm nervous, I tend to crack up in my voice. So if that happens to you too, you don't want to be sounding like Darth Vader on the phone. That won't be making for a very pleasant interview experience. So ensure that you've got what you need for you to feel relaxed. You want to ensure that you're in a quiet room. If you live with roommates, tell them that you're going on a phone interview. Make sure you have reliable Wi-Fi. Charge your phone. Charge your computer. Use a headset if possible. I found that was better than holding up the phone because my hands were free. So those are just some tips to get you more comfortable with the setting. Other things you want to ensure is because you're on the phone, you're not able to communicate as much by drawing on the board, for example. So you want to make use of things like commenting within the code to tell your interviewer exactly what you're doing. You also want to, just for your own sake, have some paper and pen nearby so that you can jot down ideas as you're going forward. Maybe you write down things you want to come back to remind yourself. And we have one tip here using copy and paste. And what we mean by that is sometimes you'll be asked to do a solution and then improve on it for another iteration. Don't delete the previous solution, first of all, and don't rewrite it because that takes up time. You are very welcome to just copy your previous solution into a new page and improve upon that. And finally, the most important thing is to ensure that you are really thinking out loud and communicating. If you need a moment to think, make sure you tell your interviewer because they can't see you in person and you suddenly go silent on the phone, they might think the connection has cut off. So make sure you just communicate a lot more than you would be if you're in person. Yeah,
and a few more tips I think that are sort of based on situations that you can easily avoid are, when you first walk into the interview or when you first pick up the phone, you're going to have a little bit of time to do sort of an introduction, and then you're probably going to jump right into a question. and your instinct might be to jump straight into just spitting out code. Try to instead take a little bit of time to ask clarifying questions. Gather requirements about whatever the problem is. Think of edge cases, think of test cases. Try to articulate your plan and get your interviewer's opinion on it, because that way we can prevent you from going down a path that will lead you nowhere. We can save you some time. We can even offer you hints if you give us the opportunity to do that. And so try to resist that urge to sort of jump straight into, just a quick solution. That said, it's okay to start with, here's a brute force approach. I can say that to you in 5 seconds. That's great. But when you get to the part of having a real big algorithm you want to try and explain, don't just start writing code, because we can help you. We can simplify it, and that'll save you a lot of time and hopefully make it just easier and more fun. Definitely go through examples at the beginning. If your interviewer doesn't give you an example, you should generate one yourself. Ask them, hey, is this kind of what you mean? Is this one example representative of all of them, or could it be much more general? Is this a reasonable example? What do you think? Ask them specific questions about what the problem is talking about, more than you would, asking for sort of just general help. Ask them something about what they've said. Repeat what they've said to you in your own words, so that you can make sure you've understood and they can know that too. Another thing we'd like to see is real code, in the sense that it could nearly compile. I'm not actually going to be mad at you for missing a semicolon or something, especially on a Google Doc. But that said, don't write purely pseudocode, except maybe as an initial explanation of an algorithm. There's lots of reasons for this. One is that at some point you do actually have to be able to talk to the computers, and they need real code. And so we look for that in our interviews. That's how we reflect. That's how we see your skills reflected in the interview. But beyond that, another reason to write real code is that you can kind of get away with stuff in real code that you can't with in pseudocode. For example, you can say, hey, is it all right if I have a subroutine that does this functionality? And your interviewer might say, yeah, sure, you can assume you have a method that does that. And then you can kind of come back to it later, or if you run out of time, your interviewer might say, yeah, I feel like you could finish that. Let's not even bother fleshing out that tiny subroutine. Real code has real advantages, so use it.
Yeah, so another thing that I think people tend to do is they go and they do a bunch of practice questions, and they try to fit the interview question to a practice question that they've seen before. So they kind of go and they memorize this particular way of solving this problem, and they just hope and they hope and pray that they can just reuse what they've done to that particular solution. So in many cases that doesn't work, doesn't translate one-to-one that way. You definitely need to draw from your previous experiences of writing code and solving different problems to understand when to use a hash map and when to use a set, things like that. But don't think, okay, this is this exact type of problem, therefore I need to remember this dynamic programming approach that I coded last night. So do not try to force fit a solution that you know very well to that particular problem. So some people, for example, they study recursion a lot before the interview. They study dynamic programming a lot, or they study prefix tree a lot, or red-black tree, and they think, okay, whatever question they ask me, I'm going to throw in the red-black tree. It's like, it's balanced, log of n, let's do it, I'm in there. Try not to do that. Definitely practice a lot, but whenever you see the problem, try to have a fresh look at it and try to think of different components. The other thing that people do a lot is they tend to, right at the beginning, they want to have the most efficient solution. And a lot of times they try doing this before they even fully understand the parameters of the question, right? So that's why it's always good to first give the naive approach to make sure you understand the problem, and then from that try to think of the different components of that naive approach and how you can solve it. So a lot of times I have to tell interviewees, can you tell me what the naive approach would be? Because they may try to use a prefix tree or one of these advanced data structures or dynamic programming, and then they would tell me what the naive approach is, and then I would ask them, what is the complexity of this naive approach? They would give me the complexity. Then I ask them, what is the complexity of this other solution you're trying to propose that uses dynamic programming? In many cases, they would say, oh, wow, actually the dynamic programming approach is less efficient than the brute force solution. And at that point, then they realize that maybe they're trying to do the wrong thing. So definitely being able to show us that you can do dynamic programming or recursion or use prefix trees are important, but make sure that you don't prematurely try to apply them, because in many cases and many problems, they're not necessary, right? Mm-hmm. So just a traditional data structure is a traditional, binary search, maybe heaps, and other data structures, hash maps, that can get you a long way. So definitely do not feel like you have to pre-optimize that early. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now what if you stumped?
What if you are stumped? First of all, it's happened to me many times as I was interviewing for companies 8 months ago. It happened in one of my Google interviews, actually, where I was asked to code up a solution as a warm-up to print a Fibonacci sequence. And I was so excited to code, I jumped right in. After I wrote it, the interviewer was very confused. And then I realized I just coded a factorial. So that was definitely something I was not supposed to do. But I took a deep breath, explained that I had wrongly assumed what I was supposed to do, clarified my understanding of what a Fibonacci sequence actually is, proceeded to code it, and I was obviously successful in that interview process. So that is to say, do not worry if you end up going down a wrong path in the beginning of the interview. Do not worry if you completely mess up on your interviews. As you mentioned earlier, your interviews are independent. So especially when you come on site, you're going to have 5 in a day. Those interviewers do not talk to each other before they write feedback on you. So if you really felt like you messed up on one, just take a deep breath, go into the next one with a blank slate, and hope to do well in that one. So that's the most important thing, is to keep your cool. Other things that you can do to help you when you get unstuck is to walk through what you've done. So sometimes I find it helpful to just reiterate exactly how I got there. And part of that talking process sometimes helps me to see a new direction. Or that gives my interviewer a chance to then jump in and suggest I try something else.
Yeah, I can add to that too. I think from my own personal example of me getting stuck, when my first interview, when I came on site, someone gave me a question and the solution required using a prefix tree. The person said, have you thought about using a prefix tree? And I did not know what a prefix tree was. I was stumped. And I said, I am not familiar with this data structure. I know a bunch of different data structures. It just so happened I never used the prefix tree before. And the interviewer explained what a prefix tree was. Because I was, I was comfortable enough with graphs and different graph and tree-based data structures. Once he explained what the prefix tree was, I was able to get unstuck. So it's okay if you're exposed to a data structure that you've never heard before. Because for the most part, data structures, most of them can be modeled as graphs. So one thing I do recommend, make sure you're comfortable with not just doing this linear linked list or array list type of algorithms. Make sure you're comfortable with graphs. Depth first search, breadth first search. If you can understand graphs, many data structures, once explained to you, and you realize it's a graph, you can apply that. And that's what I was able to do, and I think I was able to impress the interviewer, because even though I didn't know what a prefix tree was in the beginning, once he explained it, I was able to write a solution that used a prefix tree. So, so the other thing that's very important is the fact that by the time your package goes to the interview committee, you probably want as many different opinions as possible, right? So maybe 6 or 7. By the time you do the phone interviews, it might be 6 or 7 different inputs, and and you want them to be as independent as possible, because that gives more breadth, or a better scope of your capabilities. So therefore, if you mess up, it's kind of when you're taking an exam, right? If there's only 5 questions in the exam, and then you don't know 1 question, that's automatically you're getting 80%. If it's like 20 questions, that might, so I like questions, I like exam with more questions. So that's the basic way I would approach. The more interviews, it's actually a good thing.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that to say that a difference between quizzes and tests and interviews is that you're not actually supposed to know already how to do it. Mm-hmm. We're not going to say something like, what is an array list, necessarily. Hopefully we're going to give you a problem that you actually haven't seen before, something you don't quite know how to do. So a prefix tree example is great, because I didn't know what a prefix tree was until last year. And if I had had that in an interview, I would have been freaking out. So this is a perfect example of how you're supposed to be able to, we'd love to see you able to take something that you don't know and kind of wrangle that unknown into something that you do know. And that's totally what we do every day. And so that's a wonderful thing to see in an interview.
Yes. Okay, so now in terms of resources, I highly recommend Cracking the Coding Interview. I went through that textbook. Just makes you feel less anxious because you felt like you've gone through this somewhat comprehensive. It's not a very big book, but it's, it covers all the highlights, right? It makes you feel like you have good foundation for the interview. So definitely, just to relieve some anxiety, just kind of like go through the book and skim through it. If you have time to do all the different questions, definitely do that. There are also other guides. One of them is Top Coder, right? And other different website, LeetCode, where you can create an account and solve different types of problems. And once again, the more practice you do, the better. Before my interview, I practiced almost every day for about a month just to get in the mode of solving little things. So.
All right, now we're going to jump into answering some questions. So as a reminder, you have that chat box in front of you. Feel free to type a question in there.
Okay, now it's question time. First question is from Eden Freener. The question is, how does Google value coding abilities versus other abilities? Obviously, one needs to know how to code, but does Google care about the one?
The way the one
thinks. Thank you for that, because everyone thinks differently. Yeah, I got stumped. And if they do, how do you test the different abilities? That is a great question. We do value coding a lot because, as a software engineer, the vast majority of the job is coding. However, we do value communication skills. We do value ability to clearly. So as you communicate with the interviewer and explain your approach and your ability to understand, that's something that as interviewer we assess, your ability to communicate clearly, because what we try to do is envision you and our team and you being given a task and how you go about addressing that. So I would say through the interview, we try to assess not just your coding skills, but also communications and other things like that.
Great, so we got another question from David. He says, I'm nervous about the on-site interviews. It's 5 interviews in a day. Seems kind of overwhelming. So I agree. I also thought it was a bit crazy when I first heard about 5 interviews in a day. And there are some tips that I would suggest for getting through the day. So first of all, I won't lie, it is a very long day. But we do put a break in between. So you will have a lunch with what's called a lunch interviewer. So you'll have a current Google employee pick you up, take you to one of our cafes. And this is not evaluated at all. So that person that has lunch with you does not write anything up about you. So take that as an opportunity to get to know the company, to relax a little bit. Or you can simply say, I don't want to actually say too much right now. I want to have a moment of silence, or I want to take a nap. My lunch interviewer said, do you want to take a nap? I can take you to a nap pod. So that is an option as well if you feel like you need that. Secondly, hydrate a lot during the day. So we've got a ton of micro kitchens all around with coffee, tea, water, all kinds of juices. So make sure you have those in the room with you at all times. And sleep a lot the day before.
Yeah, and we also have a question. Dane Hickson asks, are there some examples of the types of code activities we will be writing? So, yes, there's plenty of examples of interview processes that show the type of questions we ask even on this YouTube channel. You can also basically just Google interviews and see a bunch of questions that, because they're now public, we've actually banned from the real interview process. But that said, it's still a wonderful way for you to see the types of questions we ask and sort of the scope of a question. There's books out there. I think there's one called Cracking the Coding Interview or something like that, Cracking the Technical Interview.
Yeah, it's on the previous slide if you rewatch these.
Okay. Check out those links, and definitely there are lots of resources out there. Yeah.
So this next question is from Unzil Chris. What was the hardest part of the technical interview to you? I would say the hardest part of the technical interview is probably the first 5 minutes, because you're going to be given a question and you're just anxious and worried that you may completely blank. And the other thing that happens is during that first 5 minutes, mentally start you have to get over the hurdle of thinking, oh my gosh, I'm completely going to fail this interview.
Mm-hmm.
So if mentally you're able to get over that hurdle and say, okay, I've seen the question, I could think of the naive solution that gives me a starting point, and then I can build upon that. Once you get a naive solution that you and your interviewer kind of see eye to eye on, they make sure you understand the question, then you can iterate over that naive solution and try to find different parts that you can optimize. So just getting to that step is the most important piece.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I wouldn't say this is the hardest part per se, but definitely one that takes some practice is coding on the whiteboard. Because you're often used to coding on your computer where there's nice text editors that help you do a lot of things magically. So you want to make sure you get comfortable. When you're practicing, I recommend writing it out on a piece of paper as if you were writing on a whiteboard, and just practice how you're going to make sure your writing is legible, how you're going to indent, follow the syntax without having a text editor in front of you.
And if you do get into a situation where you're like, oh my gosh, I can't remember the word for putting something onto a hash set. Is it add, put, or offer? Or what is it? just say like, I can't remember what it is. I know I would look it up in the Java doc or in the C++ reference. I just can't remember what it is. Explain to your interviewer what you mean, and that will be 99.9% of the whole thing.
Yes. Okay, so next question's from Ayushi. The question is, if okay, is it okay to not have the most optimized solution, but the code works? That is perfectly okay. It doesn't have to be the most optimized, but it has to be somewhat efficient, right? So I think as long as it's not the naive solution, the most inefficient solution, what the interviewer looks for is your thought process to the more optimized solution. So don't think the interviewer is looking for one solution and the most highly optimized solution in order for you to do well in the interview. It's more about what are the different foundational concepts of computer science you're using to get to an optimized solution.
Mm-hmm.
We're not out to trick you. Right. So also don't assume that because we've asked something that you feel like you know the answer to that you're like, you need to overthink it. It could be that the answer is fairly straightforward, and then that problem will sort of grow into something else. Maybe we'll change the requirements to make it a little bit more interesting after you sort of say the first solution. It's one option.
Yeah, so the next question said, if you haven't used a specific data structure and you know you have to use it to solve the problem because you've heard of it before, how do you proceed to solve the problem? This was like the typical case that I ran into. I did not really understand how that data structure was used and how to, right? And then I asked the interviewer, and then they said, well, this is what the data structure looks like. It's actually more impressive to me if the person is told what the data structure does and what it looks like. It has logarithmic inserts or whatever the case is, and they're able to, based on me giving them maybe 3 bullet points about the data structure, they're able to incorporate that into the solution. So you don't have to memorize every single data structure like AVL tree, right? You don't have to do that. It's okay.
Great. So we have a question from Ling Xiang. During the interview, does the interviewer evaluate the interviewee's coding quality? For example, if it's not too long or too hard to read. So you do make a good point. We do care about how well you code. That being said, we do not go all nitpicky on you. So we will not care if you're missing, if you forgot to close a bracket, if you're missing a semicolon. That doesn't matter. But it does matter that you structure in a way that is modular, so you break up long functions, you name your variables well, not just A, B, C, and that you use the appropriate algorithms for the problem that is at hand. Again, I would practice doing this, writing on the whiteboard, make sure that your interviewer can actually read what you're writing. That is also going to help them evaluate you.
Yeah. Okay, Martha Cornejo asks, how many questions are asked during each interview? This varies. How do you measure what's a question? So sometimes I might ask a question that starts out, with sort of a straightforward thing, and then I complicate it by saying, well, what if instead of having, only one value per key, you could have many values per key? Or what if you could have duplicates? Or what if they weren't sorted? That could be considered one question that has many parts, or you could think of it as like 2 or 3 little questions. Different interviewers might have different things they want to do. You could have 3 questions that are each kind of short and self-contained, or you could have one long one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. So I guess some final tips would be 1, definitely communicate.
Yeah.
Definitely try to come up with a naive solution as early as possible, just to demonstrate that you understand the problem. And that's to you. That's all I think about.
I'd say my biggest tip is show your interviewer how you start with what you know and transform that into something that you don't know, and then figure out over the course of the interview.
My tip is keep your calm. So, like I said, if you screw up one interview, move on to the next one. It is okay, and you haven't lost your chances.
And finally, the interviewers are trying to help you get to a solution. We want to see you succeed, and it's okay to ask for small hints, right? That's totally versus just, trying to figure it all out by yourself. So definitely understand how to leverage the interviewer, and we want to see you have a working solution in the end.
Mm-hmm. Great.
With that said,
Thanks for tuning in.
thanks for tuning in. Please go to the link and fill out the form, and yeah, enjoy.
Bye.
Bye.